welcome to our program today.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here.
Now, you've written a new book entitled Darwin's Enigma, and with the subtitle Fossils and Other Problems. What led up to your writing the book?
For a number of years prior to this, I had been working in this area of studying the scientific evidences relating to origins. As an aerospace scientist myself, I was quite interested in the scientific aspects of this whole question of how we got here.
Yes.
In my early days, I guess just after getting out of high school, while I was in the service and going to college, I was kind of on the fence. I had been told that by people like my cousin who had gone to pre-med school that evolution was pretty well proven up to the origin of man from the apes. They still had a missing link there, and he said you don't have to believe it until they find that missing link. Well, I was sort of on the fence. I thought any day they might find that missing link. So I started studying everything I could on this subject and gradually began lecturing on the subject. The New York State Education Department heard about my lecture and invited me to come to Albany and give a presentation to the New York State Board of Regents. Well, the chancellor there, Theodore Black, liked the presentation. He was quite interested, and he started a study by the New York State Education Department of both the legal and the academic aspects of this question.
I see.
He asked the deputy commissioner there for legal affairs to do a legal study. He did that, and he concluded after about 3 months that it was not illegal to teach creation theory of origins along with evolution in the public schools of New York State, and that, by the way, still stands. They have never abandoned that policy.
And this came from the Education Department itself?
From the highest education official, the Chancellor of the Board of Regents, who is on the Board of Regents. They direct the policy of the Education Department that is under the governor.
All right.
He also directed an academic study to be performed, and as part of that, the Education Department invited me to document a statement that I had made. I had made a charge that in the public schools of this nation, I had discovered the worst case of a cover-up in the history of mankind. Now, those are pretty strong words.
Well, those are strong words.
So the Education
what's the nature of the
Department
cover-up?
said, you document your charge of a cover-up of scientific data that would contradict evolution. So they asked me to go to some of the largest fossil museums and interview their curators, bring back the documentation. That is what I did. I went to 5 museums, to the British Museum of Natural History in in London. They have 7 million fossils in their museum, the greatest fossil collection in the world.
I would think
Certainly, if there are any evidence of how things got here, especially of evolution from a common ancestor, that museum certainly should have some evidences. I interviewed Dr. Patterson there, who wrote the museum's book on evolution. Then I went to the American Museum in New York. I interviewed Dr. Niles Eldridge. Now, Dr. Eldridge, along with Dr. Gould of Harvard, have come up with a new theory on evolution. They call it the hopeful monster theory, or their term is punctuated equilibria theory.
Yes, I'm acquainted with that.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they are going to be 2 of the most famous evolutionists, perhaps next to Charles Darwin before long, if they are not already. Gould is certainly the most popular writer on the subject by a factor of at least 10 in this country.
Yes.
I interviewed Dr. Eldridge, I interviewed Dr. Raup at the Chicago Field Museum, Dr. Fisher, our state paleontologist in New York, and Dr. Pilbeam, a famous anthropologist working with the Leakeys. He's curator of the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. These 5 museum officials' interviews were given back to them after they were typed up from the tapes. All of them made corrections or changes to them, except Dr. Patterson. And then I gave these interview transcripts to the New York State Education Department. Later, I made those available through the ERIC microfiche system that anyone can access through any library.
I see.
These interviews, if anyone would like to write down the number, it is ED 228-056.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you can get ED 228-055, which is a presentation I made to the to the Iowa Academy of Sciences. It's entitled How Theories on Origins Can Be Taught in Public Schools Without Controversy.
Yes.
So those two documents anyone can get by asking for the ERIC, E-R-I-C, microfiche.
Well, I'm sure some of our listeners would like to have that.
Yes, they are, I think, free. If you want a hard copy, it will cost you something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, later, I wrote the substance of these interviews down in my book, which I'm calling Darwin's Enigma. That's Darwin's Big Problem, the fossil record. Fossils and Other Problems is the correct title of the book. In the microfiche system, it's called Darwin's Enigma, the Fossil Record.
Yes.
Now, in these interviews, I discovered information that is just almost totally, the public is totally unaware of. The nature of what you find when you dig down in the Earth's surface. And this program and others forthcoming will discuss the very startling discoveries I made.
Well, we're glad that you're going to be with us all this week, and we're anxious to hear about some of those discoveries.
Well, I'll certainly begin to talk about them. By the way, without stealing the thunder from some of the other programs, I'd like to just tantalize the listeners a bit by giving them a preview of what they're going to hear.
All right, I think that'd be marvelous.
Right, Dr. Patterson at the British Museum of Natural History wrote the museum's book on evolution. I read it, and Dr. Patterson asked for comments, so I wrote back and asked him before I interviewed him. I said, why didn't you put a single picture of a transitional form, something connecting two different types of organisms?
Yes.
Why didn't you put a picture of a single one of those in your book on evolution? And in his letter that he wrote to me, April 10th, 1979, he made some of the most revealing statements that I have ever heard. And if we could just get these statements into every textbook in the country, there would be absolutely no reason for any controversy about how theories on origins should be taught.
I see.
If I might just take a minute, I'll tell you what he said. I'll read part of the letter. Dr. Patterson, now this evolutionist, as far as I know, an atheist, said, quote, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them, unquote. So here's a man from the greatest fossil collection in the world, someone who has dedicated his life's work to working in the field of evolution, and he says he doesn't even know of a single transitional form, fossil or living, and of course fossils provide the only scientific evidence, direct evidence of what actually happened in the past.
Well, that is really astounding.
Isn't that amazing?
That's astounding.
Now, if we could just get that letter, now that was only one sentence. In every single sentence in his letter, he said the same type of thing. Later he said, I will add on the line, there is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Again, he said it's easy enough to make up stories, but such stories are not part of science.
Yes.
If we could just get that type of information in the public schools, we wouldn't really need to spend any time at all discussing a competitive theory of evolution.
I see.
Many times the opponents of an open hearing of this subject say, we ought to have equal time. Well, you know that you didn't ask for equal time in your bill in Louisiana. No bill has ever asked for equal time. We asked for a balanced treatment.
Yes.
And I contend that you could put a whole half a book on evolution into a textbook, and if you just put Dr. Patterson's letter in, that would give you a pretty balanced treatment, because
well, it really
the world would believe in evolution if they heard a testimony such as this, but that is now meticulously censored from the textbooks. Our children have no way of hearing about that type of information.
And so that's part of the cover-up that you refer to.
Absolutely. A man in the White House told me, in the Education Department, he said, you tell the media that you have documentation of the worst cover-up in the history of mankind, and you'll get their attention. Now, sure enough, I did get somebody's attention. You've probably heard of William Rusher.
Yes.
He is the editor. He is the publisher of National Review magazine, and of course, William Buckley is the editor of that.
Well, Mr. Sunderland, it's been such a pleasure having you with us today. You've been a real friend of the Legal Defense Fund, and we have distributed hundreds and hundreds of your book, Darwin's Enigma, and we hope that our listeners will join us again tomorrow as we continue this interview with you.
Fine. Thank you very much.
Now, this is Paul Humber. Before we go on to the next segment, I want to help you to realize that Dr. Patterson, that he has quoted, the letter and so on, there's another video that I put up on YouTube. It's called Dr. Colin Patterson, Evolution Conveys Anti-Knowledge. And the thing that's special about that is you can hear Dr. Patterson in his own voice. He's got a British accent. It's hard to follow it, but I've given the words there in the video so you can actually read when he's speaking. And there are many evolutionists who want to say, oh no, he's denied this, that, or whatever. But you can hear his own voice. So now let us resume to the next part of this interview between Bill Keith and Luther Sunderland.
4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Sunderland, welcome back to our program today.
It's great to be back again. Thank you, Bill.
At the close of yesterday's program, you were talking about getting the attention of some of the people in the news media, and you mentioned William Rusher in particular, and I would like for you to continue with that account.
Yes. The National Review magazine.
A very prestigious magazine.
Yeah, it's very prestigious. He's quite an intellectual. In fact, he has written the book on debating how to win an argument.
Uh-huh.
So I sent William Rusher a copy of my book.
Yes.
And he said that really got his attention. He said 3 great concepts in history had been ushered in during the Age of Enlightenment to rescue mankind from all its ills. At least they offered to. One was Marxism, one was Freudianism, one was Darwinism.
Mm-hmm.
He said all 3 of these have now been discredited. In no communist country is Marxism not in retreat. Nobody believes in Freud anymore. And he said, this book just wipes out Darwinism. He said he had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker 44 years ago at Princeton. He said
that is
swallowed him
language.
whole. And he said that God could stick around if he chose by claiming to have invented these principles, but he wasn't really necessary. Now, he said he read my book, Darwin's Enigma, Fossils and Other Problems, and that convinced him. So he published this article and several other excellent columns in over 200 newspapers across the country.
And I'll bet that stirs up the evolutionists.
Well, it certainly does, and when other people, like the editor of Harper's Magazine, in February of last year, printed an excellent article, very critical of Darwinism. Tom Bethel, the contributing editor of Harper's, printed about a 5 or 6 page article in which he quoted liberally from Dr. Patterson's letter that we read yesterday on the air. And then I think it was April 8th, both Newsweek and Time came out with very startling articles. Newsweek's article, April 8th, 85, was entitled Science Contra. Darwin. In other words, science against Darwin.
Yes.
They said, quote, "So heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business," unquote. That's quite a statement. That was a result of the article in Harper's, and then, of course, the same day, Time came out with an article that just blasted the very foundation of modern evolution. Most evolutionists admit the fossil record has no support, gives no support whatsoever for evolution, but they think that genetics has the answer. And one of the main arguments is that in the DNA code, that is the genes and chromosomes of every cell in every living organism, they all share a common coding. There are 20 amino acids in all cells, and there are 4 letters in the DNA code that code these amino acids, and it takes 3 rungs on the DNA ladder to code 1 amino acid.
I see.
Now, those codes are the same, they used to say, all the way from a single cell, all the way up to man, all throughout plant life, all throughout animal life. Whenever you found 3 rungs on the ladder that said A, B, B, for instance, that meant code a certain amino acid, and another code meant stop the chain. Well, lo and behold, according to Time magazine, April 8th,
Yes.
they got to looking around at something other than a little single-celled organism that we have in our intestines called E. coli. When they also then started looking at the paramecium, they found the code was different. In one case, the code said stop making amino acids, and in the other case, it said make another amino acid. So the article said the discovery undermines the universality of the genetic code, and it may cause scientists to rethink certain theories about evolution. Indeed, it wipes out the basic argument for evolution. The DNA code is not universal, and therefore, how in the world could it ever have changed in the middle of the stream somewhere?
I see.
Evolution, we're really connecting all life to a common ancestor.
In other words, during the evolutionary process.
That's correct.
Well, that is a remarkable discovery. All right, Mr. Sunderland, how about the possibility of our going into the question of can science tell us how we got here? I know that's a subject you've discussed.
Of course, that's a good question, isn't it?
Can science tell us how we got here?
Everybody, since as far as we can tell, since the beginning of time, has wondered how we got here. And today, because science can do many marvelous things, we put men on the moon, and we bring people television programs right in their living room from all over the world by satellite, and we do brain surgery and all those marvelous things. Well, couldn't science shed some light on how we got here? That's the question.
Yes.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think it can shed some light, but it can't really prove any theory on origins. Now, do you know what the word science means? Science means simply knowledge.
Yes.
At least originally it meant knowledge. But later we came to think of it as that study that would, through testing, verify certain theories about the natural world. That is, we sort of think that it will prove certain theories. Well, science doesn't ever prove anything. Science only can disprove theories. Here's the way it works. Suppose we see something happening that we don't know the reason of, for instance, rain falling from the sky.
Yes.
We might decide, we might think up a reason for that. Someone might think it might be caused by birds weeping. So they are compelled to write that explanation down, their theory, publish it, and let everyone tear it apart and test it, so forth. Well, the first guy that disproves that theory, in other words, the first time it's raining and birds aren't flying overhead, they've disproved the theory.
Yes.
You're now compelled to deposit your theory in the trash can or modify it to make it fit the facts.
Yes.
Now, in order for a theory or an idea to be considered a truly scientific theory, it must be about some observable process, something that will repeat itself so you can test it, something you can falsify. If you can't figure out a way to falsify the theory, it's not part of science. It might be true. History, for instance, is true, but you can't repeat it and test it.
What does it mean to falsify something?
Well, for instance, Your theory is that rain is caused by birds weeping.
And so you falsified that by proving it to be wrong.
Right. You look up and there are no birds in the sky, and it's a clear day, you know, and you know there are no birds up there, and therefore you've disproved the theory. That maybe is a weak example.
Well, I've always wondered about when it says that a true scientific theory must be falsifiable.
That's what it means. You've got to figure out a way to prove it false, or it's not part of science. Now, would you believe that neither theory and origins can meet any one of those requirements of a scientific theory? Neither evolution nor the competitive concept that things abruptly appeared on Earth fully formed. Neither of those concepts are truly science. Why is that? Evolution isn't supposedly an ongoing process. It never repeats itself. Everything goes from simple to complex, but you can't convert man back into a single cell and then repeat the process.
I see.
See, evolution really is defined as the concept that all life came from a common ancestor.
Yes.
All these other explanations and definitions are just a lot of words.
Yes.
It is not true that evolution is simply change. That's very deceptive, because there is much change going on, and both theories think there is much change. People on both sides of the fence. That's deceptive. It's like saying a doorknob is a house. Well, certainly a doorknob's part of a house, but that's not the whole story. Change is part of evolution, but the whole story is, the bottom line is common ancestry of all life without any outside interference.
I see.
Okay, now we're explaining why evolution wasn't part of science. It's not repeatable. It would take 250,000 years to maybe 10 million years to convert one species into another out in nature. Therefore, you can't observe evolution happening. You can't test it if you can't observe it. Therefore, it's really not part of science. Now, I'm not the only one saying that, because Dr. Karl Popper, who is considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of science who has ever lived, has said, quote, "Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program," unquote. In other words, a religious program of some sort. The British Museum of Natural History, 1980, had in one of their displays that Darwinism is not testable science. They had to censor that out of their displays when the scientific community came down on their heads, but at least it was there for a while. Now, Darwinism or evolution is not science. Now, what about the idea that things abruptly appeared on Earth fully formed? That certainly is not part of science. That would have been unique history, and you can't test history scientifically.
I see.
Now, however, we can look at these two general concepts and compare them against the scientific data to see which is the more credible. Now, we're never proving either one, but we certainly can raise the credibility of one. If you go out and the first time you pick up a rock that disproves one theory or the other, that will shed some light on the subject.
Well, Mr. Sunderland, it's been such a pleasure having you again today, and we look forward to picking up this program on tomorrow's program.
Fine. We'll look at the fossils tomorrow.
All right.
Okay. I'm hoping that after seeing part 1, you'll be motivated to see part 2. I have to turn the cassette over to the other side, so there's a little bit of a break here. My name is Paul Humber, and you can look at other videos. In fact, I plan to refer to that video that I mentioned, Dr. Patterson. You can hear him in his own voice, and I suspect that I have contact information on that video. But let's stop this right now.